Okay, I'm back to talk about PHP this time. So I've done a lot of talking about JavaScript and WebAssembly, both very interesting topics, but it happens that one of the other things that I've been doing a lot recently in terms of employment is PHP. So I'm going to go through some of my PHP projects, none of which are actually really in use for very much, but I'm going to go through them anyway, and explain what's going on there so that you can get a sense of what this crazy nonsense is that is PHP. So, first thing I'll just cover quickly is the code layout of a project. So normally you would want to have something like this for anything that you expect to be requiring using Composer in another project. So Composer is the uh, de facto standard package manager for PHP. I'm sure there are other package managers, but the ones that you always see referred to are Composer ones. Um, and typically the way you use that is you type composer space require space and then the name of something which has been published. It's not difficult to get something published. You can make that happen. I'm not going to cover that today, but um, it is a thing that you can do. You can also refer to a specific Git URL if you want to require a project which is still a valid Composer project, just using Git or GitHub, whatever it might be. So typically you want to have a directory for having all of the actual PHP files that will be used in it. I've gone for lib. I don't know off the top of my head if lib is absolutely the genuine standard. There's been, you'll find quite a lot of different approaches in different PHP packages that you may require, but I mean, mostly newer ones will give at least a single very clear top level name, like lib or like src, to communicate that this is where all of the contents are. And you might notice that inside lib I've just got a directory, nothing else. This is so that you can have you can maintain the property that you can see in the directory path exactly what the class name is, or trait name, or interface name, whatever it might be, which makes life easier for people. Again, it may not be it isn't done, but with 100% of packages. I don't know absolutely for certain if it's best practice, but it is certainly a good idea to do that. So it's really easy to tell from looking at the file that what I have here is something which is curl psr/handler, and it's not just handler. Even though I might be able to work it out from looking at other things, that's the information that I would want. Typically, you should have some tests. It would be great if you could have tests. It's for the best to do that. This directory is set up for PHP unit. There are other testing mechanisms available, but this is the one that I'm using. And so for PHP unit, it wants to have files in whatever the directory is. So ideally test, I mean, you can have T if you really want to, but test is more explicit about that. So it wants to have files which end with the word test.php. It doesn't care too much about what the actual class is in there. It just wants to load a class and then it'll deal with it. And you can stick a number at the beginning to make sure that you get a sane order, an order that you're expecting. Strictly speaking, of course, this isn't exactly a number. This is just enforcing an alphabetical order that is the same as the order that you might expect it to be. So if I shortened these and I had more than 10, then number 10 would come after number 1, not after number 9, because it's literally just lexical order that it's using. Um, I'm not going to go into what goes in these just yet. I will come back to that. And certainly, so as you can see, I do have like a test lib directory. This is kind of a hairy issue because Composer doesn't really know of a way to express express dependencies which aren't actually going to be in the dependencies to install. In terms of the dependencies which are local to the project. Yeah, it can be a little bit complicated dealing with that. I don't know how I've included that here. I'll get back to that and I will find out. You can see I've actually got another file inside test, which does some other stuff. That's fine. It's perfectly consistent to have that. And well, I mean, some other people might argue with me on this. I think it's fine because I know that there's only a specific pattern that PHP unit will look for, and it will ignore everything else. So, yes, it's not my concern particularly. We've got a git ignore file. You should always have a .git ignore. There will always be generated files, and really, really important is that you make sure that you do not commit generated files which you do not intend to commit. And it's very easy to do that accidentally. You can easily just type git add and a directory, including dot, and accidentally you've just included like 3,000 files that you didn't mean to include. So getting your git ignore right in the first place, at least getting it into a sensible state in the first place, is very much worth your time. These two files that I'm ignoring here are the vendor directory, which is meaningful if I'm doing testing or if I'm doing stuff directly in this copy. It's not meaningful in terms of fully deployed. In other words, if some other project is requiring it, this git ignore will actually do nothing helpful. And composer.lock, which is the file that gets generated by Composer when it does its install. So they serve similar purposes. Vendor contains the code for all of the dependencies, and composer.lock contains a brief description of what the dependencies are. I'm not going to say that's the perfect structure for it. That's just what Composer uses. Personally, I would probably have a directory with I would probably put composer.lock inside the vendor directory and have a little bit more structure from there. But that's the Composer guy's business. So yes. So apart from that, having a changes.md, it's a good idea. It's not strictly. I don't think anybody strictly requires it. It is great for communicating to users though, because they won't necessarily know what the changes you've made mean. So here I've got a bunch of brief change messages. That's all you really need. It's just something so that people don't have to stop and think, oh, I need to now look at the git changelog between these revisions, and maybe the git changelog isn't very descriptive. Or maybe it is, and it's just a lot of changes, and you don't really know what those changes mean. So this is the place where you would put the little bits of information about what those changes are. That's the thing that's common, really, to most repositories that you might have. Regardless of the language, you probably would have like a changes.md or something like that. And similarly, you might well have a lib in a test directory, even if it's another language. So we've got composer.json. That's absolutely standard. If you want to create this, you do composer init to help you go through it. But you can also just build it manually. That's fine. The only guidance I would give on that is if you want to build it manually, look for a relatively small project that's fairly new, because it's really easy to find yourself looking at some composer.json which is like 5 years old or so and hasn't been updated, uses PSR0 auto loading, or all kinds of nightmarish things. So so if you're going to copy it, you want a new one. Otherwise, just Composer in it ideally. If you really want to, you can read the spec for what Composer files look like. That's not incredibly boring. You can do that. It's fairly meaningful, but you'll get a bit more out of if you're thinking of building a file manually. You get a bit more out of looking at other examples, looking at cases that already exist. So composer.lock you don't create manually, like the vendor directory. That's something that Composer creates for you. You should create a license file. This is something GitHub will really shove down your throat. And in this case, it actually is. This is a GitHub generated one. Thank you, GitHub. You did a good job there. Mostly, if you're in terms of picking a license, there are a whole bunch of licenses. It's not worth worrying too much as long as you are the only contributor. It won't be a big issue. But as soon as there are other people contributing, you will want to have a specific license that you can work with going forwards. And when other people are using your code, they may have license requirements that they have. In general, I go for the 2-clause or 3-clause BSD license. That's a nice, straightforward one that's not particularly restrictive. Other ones that you can consider might be the LGPL, which I don't even know really if people use that much anymore, but it's one that exists. Normally GPL is not one that I'd recommend going for, whether it's 2 or 3, just in terms of the fact that it refers to. So LGPL is for libraries, GPL is for whole programs. So the GPL license terms essentially say, no, you can't produce any program using this code unless it's GPL, which is a huge problem if that code is in a library, because it means that suddenly anybody who's using it has to be GPL compliant. So unless you're really, really keen for everybody to use the GPL, don't use GPL. But again, so LGPL should be okay for that purpose, but it's still very wordy, and for that reason, I normally avoid it. And you do see other licenses like the Apache license. There are a whole bunch of them. I would say do your own research if you want to work out what a good license is. And finally, readme.md. So it might sound redundant in a lot of cases, but you want to have something which says what this thing is and how to use it. In particular, that's very useful if somebody's going to your GitHub, because that readme.md will just be instantly splattered out. They will see it at the bottom. It will be nicely formatted. It makes life easy. But also for people who might be on the command line, it's useful for them to be able to see this stuff. Again, this is your key opportunity to communicate to people how it is that you expect them to use your program or library, whatever it is. You absolutely will want to have an example in there, but this is also a great time to just describe just everything you're thinking. Obviously, if it gets too wordy, don't put all of that in a README. Nobody's going to read like a 10,000 word document telling them what the program is. But you can have a wiki, for example, and you can just link to that. So the README should be relatively terse, but it should give people a clear idea of what you're expecting, and a clear idea what they should expect. In particular, you probably will want to have some kind of a bug section or something, so that you've got a place to put information about the things you haven't covered, the things you haven't done. Because sometimes, well, realistically, a lot of the time, you may write code and think, oh, yeah, there's this extremely complicated situation which I'm not going to deal with because I don't think it's important or because I don't think that people come across this situation. And when you have one of those, that's a good time to stop and write it down in the README so that people who might look at your code will understand whether it will work for them. And if it does work for them, but perhaps has some bugs, they might understand what the nature of those bugs are. Obviously, it's not something that would mean that you would never consider making changes to support a thing, but it just helps people out in terms of understanding what's going on. Okay, so I'm going to go back to composer.json to describe what's going on there, because that's the file that really you will start with these, and this is what the key to this is the key to how everything is loaded and how it's used in the PHP sense. So you got a name and a description and a license. So these you should run through Composer in it. That will help you with that stuff. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there. I will say, so description is fairly useful to have. I mean, people do search on that. People do occasionally see it. But for most routine operations, the only description isn't used, but the name is used. And the name has a specific format, as my little tooltip is telling me here. Yeah, so the name is a very specific thing. So yes, in Composer, you have a require section. So this is for things. This is saying that when somebody does a Composer install of your module or Composer update, perhaps, these are the specific modules and versions that are required. You can see at the top I've actually got a specific version of PHP that I'm requiring. That's because I'm doing some fancy things with PHP, which are relatively recent. I would say with this kind of thing, it's very easy to get this wrong. And in general, you find that people don't refer to a specific version of PHP that they're requiring. They may do that if people if there's a brand new version of PHP and you're using that brand new functionality, you probably will want to stick require PHP in there. Obviously, if you have an understanding of what the syntax is that you're using, and that understanding is fairly good, then you can say this requires this version of PHP. And in particular, if you're using a version of PHP that's not that old, so here on macOS, it must have been PHP 7.1 at the time. I don't know whether it is still. In fact, I'll just have a quick look because it's very easy to find out. PHP-V. No, 7.3. There you go. So now it's 7.3. So I don't. Yeah. So I don't completely trust that. That I'm writing everything 7.1 compliant now, so I might change this to 7.3. And so it's completely possible that you might have a require that's old. Sorry, I did the wrong thing for undo there. You might have a require that's old, and technically you're requiring newer versions than are actually documented here. This is a situation that happens. It doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen. And when that comes up, hopefully somebody will tell you that they're getting an error message, and you'll work out that it's because you're actually using something which is a newer version of a dependency, and you'd written it was for an older version. And when that comes up, you might either update the require to show the correct version, which will help people get sorted out, or you might but fix the compatibility on it. In practice, there may be some other fanciness that you need to do if you're a composer package author to correct old versions of the package or retire them. But yeah, essentially, kind of the key thing is that if you get caught flat-footed, you can update it. So it's like the next version will correctly express it, and you can retire the versions which are bad. So yes, you can see actually that I'm using one of my own modules, which is very entertaining, and I've published it. So this could be Git URL, I believe. I would have to double check that. It's actually, no, what? No, this can't be a Git URL, but this would still have to be a package URL. But you can put a Git URL in your repositories list. That's how it works. Anyway, so yeah, you can just list the things that people using your stuff will require here, including general stuff like what PHP version it is, what extensions are installed. That's another common one. But mostly you'll want to not have extensions, and potentially if you're compatible with a PHP that's several years old, you might want to not even have a PHP requirement because it's not really useful. It's not really going to communicate anything to anybody. It would just be noise essentially. So autoload. This is the main section which says how to get to your things. Specifically, this is actually instructing the composer autoloader how to map stuff to your thing. PSR4 is the type that you normally use. If you use PSR0, you deserve to be slapped. Don't do that. You can find the definitions of those. You can search for PSR4. Just Google for it or whatever. DuckDuckGo for it. Or you can just go to phpfig, which is php-fig.org, and that's got all of the PSRs in it. So those are standardized ways of doing things. PSR4 is a standardized way of autoloading. There is another one which is called PSR0, which probably somebody thought was brilliant at the time, but wasn't very good in terms of performance. So the way that PSR4 works is you have a prefix for the class name. Technically, I think this probably is arbitrary, but if you do it without a trailing slash, you again deserve to be slapped. And it's got a directory that maps to. So when the autoloader is running, it will look for things which start with the prefix on the left. It will chop that prefix off, and then it will take the suffix of the class name that's remaining. It will swap backslashes for forward slashes. It'll stick .php at the end, and then it will look for this followed by that resultant file name. So that makes it easy for PHP to do the loading because it can just see what the full class name is, and it can just look through for things which it could be, and it will, at the end of that, have a list of possible things it can, possible file name paths that could be used. For a whole project, you might have the empty prefix mapped to lib or whatever. In general, that's a bad idea. Certainly for something that's going to be included from elsewhere, you want to have a name which exactly maps to the tail of the name of the package, and obviously that can technically refer to just any directory where that stuff is. But again, ideally you would put the same name in the directory as well. So scripts is just stuff that you can run through Composer. In this case, so having this here means I can type Composer test, and that will run PHP unit. And required dev, again, a good thing to have. This so this won't be installed when your program is used as a dependency. So if somebody types composer require, did I say composer install before? Well, it's composer require. I'm pretty sure. Yes, composer require. So when somebody types composer require your package name, they will get all of the require stuff installed automatically. They will not get the require dev stuff. So this is the place to put stuff like test functionality and stuff that might be used to compile things, maybe, like tooling that you would use during development. But it's not the place to put stuff that will be used whenever anybody is using your code. Right, so that was nice and descriptive. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the other things here. So for tests, you should have tests. this isn't the biggest thing in the world, but you should have tests. So I'm using PHP Unit here. There are other testing frameworks that exist. Whatever framework you're using, look for its documentation. It will be documented. It will be very thoroughly documented. If it's any good at all, you will want to read up on that. But in essence, you will want to have tests for making sure that the methods that you have do roughly what you think they do in terms of behavior from an outside perspective. So if you have classes that operate on external things, so for example, classes which perhaps you pass in an object and they operate on that object, or where they're doing network operations or file system operations, you will probably want to do some stubbing. So create stub methods in your test doubles, which is what PHP Unit calls them. I don't have any here, but so I'm doing something a little bit fancy, which is compatible with that though. So yes, if you're so in other words, so if you're doing something other than input and output, you will want to have some way of capturing exactly what happens. So here in this case, I've actually got a I've created a class that I can just use and pass into the code, or actually receive out of, it appears. But in any case, it's the same general thing. So you can if your code supports generalized objects, then and it operates on those objects, then it's relatively straightforward. You can use that to retain the information about what exactly they did. If it doesn't, you can use basically fake objects which derive from the main object in question. And oh yeah, so this is what this is in fact. But you can also do this natively inside PHP Unit. So you can have an object which derives from one of the objects that would be in use, and you can use that to do the work and capture what would happen, and perhaps prevent any of the work actually occurring. Yes, okay, so I will actually go over what this test library is doing. So not the actual tests themselves, but although I might touch on that, but I will go over what this test library is doing next time, and then I'll get into the code, and then maybe into some other projects. We shall see. Anyway, that's all for this time. So yeah, thank you for watching.